"Walk alone," Robert screamed, throwing his parents' worn suitcase onto the dusty road, while 73-year-old Mary collapsed to her knees, watching her own son drive away without looking back. But what Robert didn't know was that this moment of cruelty would trigger a chain of events that would destroy everything he'd built with stolen money. 6 months later, in a packed courtroom, that same fragile woman would rise from her chair and deliver testimony so powerful it would leave everyone speechless. The signature Robert learned to write as a child in their backyard dirt had become the weapon he used to rob his own parents, but it would also become the evidence that brought him down. This is the story of abandonment, justice, and the unbreakable power of dignity that shocked an entire community. The dust swirled like ghosts on that dirt road, and George could taste the bitterness in his mouth as Robert's car came to a hard stop. The engine was still running, impatient, like it couldn't wait to get away from what was about to happen. "Get out," Robert said, not even looking back at his parents. His voice was cold as winter morning air. Mary's hands were shaking as she reached for the door handle. 73 years old, and her own son was talking to her like she was nothing. George helped her down from the back seat, his old bones creaking with every movement. Robert threw their worn suitcase onto the ground with a thud. The zipper was already broken, held together with a piece of rope George had tied around it just that morning. Everything they owned in the world right there in that beat-up case. "Walk alone," Robert said, his eyes hard as stone. The car lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust that got into everything. Their clothes, their hair, their lungs. Mary watched those taillights disappear around the bend, and something inside her chest just broke. Standing there on that empty road, with the sun beating down and nowhere to go, she remembered another day on this very same path. Decades ago, when Robert and Linda were just little ones, walking hand in hand with her to Sunday service, their tiny voices singing hymns, their faces bright with innocence. Now, here she was, abandoned by those same children she'd given everything to. The silence after the car was gone felt heavier than the suitcase at their feet. George put his arm around Mary's shoulders, and they both stood there, two souls lost in the middle of nowhere. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to give your whole life to your children, only to be thrown away when you need them most? The sun was merciless that afternoon, beating down on George and Mary as they walked that endless dirt road. Their feet were cracked and bleeding, their lips dry as autumn leaves. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. Mary stumbled first. Her legs just gave out, like they'd been holding her up for 73 years, and finally decided they'd had enough. She hit the ground hard, her worn dress tearing on the rocky path. "Mary, don't leave me now," George whispered, kneeling beside her, his voice breaking. He tried to lift her, but his own body was shaking from exhaustion and heartbreak. That's when they heard it, the sound of an engine slowing down. A modest blue sedan pulled over, and out stepped a young man in a wrinkled suit. David Miller, 28 years old, fresh out of law school, and still believing the world could be fair. "Oh my God," David said, rushing over. "What happened to you folks?" He didn't wait for an answer. David grabbed a water bottle from his car, helped Mary sit up, and draped his jacket over her shoulders. The kindness in his eyes was something George hadn't seen in months. "We can't just leave you here," David said, helping them both to their feet. "Come on, let me take you somewhere safe." In the back seat of that car, as it bounced along the rough road, George closed his eyes and whispered a prayer so quiet only heaven could hear. "Lord, if you still see us, thank you for sending us help." David drove them to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a kind woman who took in folks who had nowhere else to go. That night, lying in his own bed across town, David stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Was finding them really just a coincidence? Or was he being called for something greater? The next morning at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, George sat at the small kitchen table with a folder of papers spread out before him. His weathered hands shook as he opened the worn manila envelope he'd been carrying in that old suitcase. "These are all the documents I kept," George told David, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never understood much about legal papers, but I saved everything." David pulled his chair closer, studying each document with the careful eye of a lawyer. Bank statements, power of attorney forms, property deeds, all bearing signatures that made his stomach turn. "George," David said slowly, "do you remember signing any of these power of attorney papers?" The old man squinted at the signatures. That looks like my name, but I don't recall putting pen to paper for most of these." As David examined the documents more closely, a pattern emerged. Robert and Linda had been systematically draining their parents' retirement checks for months. Worse yet, they'd taken out a mortgage on the small piece of land George had inherited from his own father. George's mind drifted back 40 years, to a sunny afternoon in their backyard. Little Robert, maybe 6 years old, asking his daddy to teach him how to write his name. George had found a stick and showed him how to scratch Robert in the dirt, letter by letter. "That's my boy," George had said proudly, watching his son practice over and over. Now that same signature had become a weapon pointed straight at his heart. David closed the folder with a sharp snap. His jaw was set, his eyes blazing with the kind of righteous anger that turns good men into fighters. "George, Mary," he said, looking at both of them. "We don't just have a story of abandonment here. We have a crime, a strong case, but they won't give up easily. Are you ready to go the distance?" While George and Mary slept in their modest room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, sharing a single blanket and grateful for a roof over their heads, the city lights twinkled 40 miles away, where their children lived a completely different reality. Robert's downtown apartment was everything money could buy: marble countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that stretched across the glittering skyline. He and Linda sat on his expensive leather couch, raising crystal wine glasses in a toast to their newfound freedom. "To finally cutting the dead weight," Robert said, his smile cold as winter morning. Linda forced a laugh, but something twisted in her chest. For just a moment, she remembered being 7 years old, sick with fever, and her mother Mary sitting by her bedside all night, singing soft hymns and placing cool washcloths on her forehead. "You're thinking about them again," Robert said, noticing the shadow that crossed her face. "Linda, they were nothing but a burden, always asking for help, always needing something. This is our time now." He gestured toward the expensive artwork on his walls, the designer furniture, the lifestyle they'd built with their parents' retirement money. "Look what we've accomplished. Look how far we've come." Linda nodded and took another sip of wine, pushing down the guilt that kept trying to surface. She pulled out her phone and posted another picture on social media, the two of them smiling, living their best life, with expensive city lights twinkling behind them. But 40 miles away, in that simple boarding house room, George and Mary knelt beside their narrow bed. Their knees ached against the worn wooden floor, but they bowed their heads and whispered their evening prayer. "Lord, thank you for this warm place to sleep," Mary said softly. "Thank you for Mrs. Henderson's kindness, and for the soup she shared with us tonight." George squeezed her hand. "And thank you for sending David to help us. Whatever comes next, we trust you'll see us through." In that small room, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and their faith to sustain them, they found a peace that all of Robert's money couldn't buy. What weighs more at the end of life, luxury bought with lies, or the peace of a clean heart? 3 weeks later, the courthouse steps felt like climbing a mountain for George and Mary. Their worn shoes clicked against the cold marble floor as they entered the intimidating building where their fate would be decided. David walked beside them, carrying a briefcase full of evidence, while George and Mary wore the only decent clothes they owned: a faded blue dress for her, a patched suit jacket for him. The contrast couldn't have been sharper when Robert and Linda walked in, wearing expensive tailored suits, looking like they owned the world. "Remember," David whispered to them, "just tell the truth. That's all we need." But truth felt fragile in that cold courtroom, surrounded by wood paneling and stern-faced portraits of judges from decades past. Mary's hands shook as she clutched the small Bible she'd carried since her wedding day, its leather cover worn smooth by years of faithful reading. Robert and Linda's lawyer was a sharp-dressed man with cold eyes and a voice like broken glass. He paced in front of Mary like a predator circling prey. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness, "you claim you don't remember signing these power of attorney documents. Isn't it true that your memory has been failing for years?" Mary's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sir, I don't recall signing most of those papers." The lawyer smiled like a shark sensing blood. "So you admit your memory is unreliable. How can this court trust anything you say?" Mary felt the weight of every eye in that courtroom pressing down on her. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might give out right there. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer so quiet only heaven could hear. "Lord, stand with me." When she opened her eyes, something had changed. Her back straightened. Her voice grew stronger. "I don't remember the day I signed those papers, sir," she said, looking directly at Robert across the courtroom. "But I remember the day I taught my son to sign his name for the very first time." The silence that followed was deafening, more powerful than any accusation, more damning than any evidence. Even Robert couldn't meet her eyes. After that powerful moment in the courtroom, David knew he needed more than just papers to win this case. He needed people, real voices that could speak to who George and Mary truly were. The next morning he drove the winding country roads back to their hometown, a place where everybody knew everybody and secrets were harder to keep. His first stop was Dr. Williams' office, the family physician who'd been treating Mary for over 20 years. The elderly doctor pulled out her medical files with careful hands. "Mary Patterson is as sharp as they come," Dr. Williams said firmly. "Her mind is clear, her memory intact. I'd stake my reputation on it." From there, David walked to the First National Bank on Main Street. The manager, Mr. Foster, had worked there for 30 years and remembered every suspicious transaction. It was always Robert or Linda who came in, Mr. Foster explained, shaking his head. Never George or Mary themselves. They'd withdraw large amounts from the retirement account, sometimes the whole monthly check. When I asked about it, they'd say their parents were too sick to come in person. But it was the visit to their old neighborhood that broke David's heart. Mrs. Thompson, their next-door neighbor for 40 years, invited him into her modest kitchen for coffee and conversation. "Those two were the kindest souls you'd ever meet," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "George would shovel my walkway every winter without being asked. Mary would bring me soup when I was sick." Then Mrs. Thompson disappeared into her bedroom and returned with something that would change everything. A letter written in Mary's careful handwriting. "She asked me to help her write this about 6 months ago," Mrs. Thompson said. "She was so lonely, David, so heartbroken that her children never visited, never called." David read the letter with growing anger. In Mary's own words, she'd written about the emptiness of holidays spent alone, the silence of a telephone that never rang, the ache of watching other families gather while hers stayed away. "I don't understand what I did wrong," the letter said. "I gave them everything I had. Now all I have are memories and prayers that someday they'll remember they have a mother who loves them." This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was proof of a heart breaking in slow motion, one silent day at a time. Have you ever known someone who suffered in silence while the world around them had no idea? The newspaper headline hit the streets like a lightning bolt. "Parents abandoned by their own children. Elder abuse case shocks community." Within hours, Robert's phone was buzzing with calls from his boss, his colleagues, his so-called friends. By noon, he was sitting in his supervisor's office, watching his career crumble like a sandcastle hit by waves. "We can't have this kind of publicity associated with our firm," his boss said, sliding a termination letter across the mahogany desk. "Clear out your office by 5. Linda fared no better. Her real estate clients cancelled appointments, her social media was flooded with angry comments, and her business partners distanced themselves like she had some contagious disease. Back at their expensive apartment, the bills started piling up. Credit card companies called, demanding payments. The mortgage company sent threatening letters. Their fancy lifestyle, built on stolen retirement money, was falling apart faster than they could count. "This is all your fault," Linda screamed at Robert as they sat surrounded by empty wine bottles and unpaid bills. "You said they'd never fight back. How was I supposed to know they'd find some crusading lawyer?" Robert shot back, his voice slurred from drinking. "They were supposed to just disappear quietly." Meanwhile, 40 miles away, George and Mary sat at Mrs. Henderson's simple wooden table, sharing a meal of homemade soup and fresh bread. The evening light streamed through the small window, casting a peaceful glow over their humble dinner. "Lord, thank you for this bread," Mary said softly, reaching for George's weathered hand. "Thank you for keeping us safe and for David's help." George squeezed her fingers gently. "And thank you for showing us that even in our darkest hour, you haven't forgotten us." They had nothing but each other and their faith, yet their hearts were lighter than they'd been in months. Back in the city, the fighting between Robert and Linda escalated. Accusations flew like broken glass, each blaming the other for their downfall. "I'm done with this," Robert finally exploded, grabbing his suitcase. "Find your own way out of this mess." And just like that, he walked out on Linda, abandoning her the same way he'd abandoned his parents on that dusty road. The cycle was complete. The courthouse was packed that morning, standing room only. Word had spread through the community about the elderly couple who'd been abandoned on a dirt road by their own children. People came to witness justice, to see if the system would protect the most vulnerable among them. George and Mary sat in the front row, their hands intertwined like they'd been for 52 years of marriage. Mary wore her Sunday dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that she'd saved for special occasions. George had borrowed a tie from David, though his shirt collar was a little too big now. He'd lost weight during these difficult months. Across the aisle, Robert and Linda sat separately, no longer speaking to each other. Robert's expensive suit looked wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. Linda stared at her hands, her designer purse sitting empty beside her. She'd already pawned most of her jewelry to pay bills. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the weight of 30 years on the bench behind him. He'd seen every kind of family dispute, but this case had kept him awake at night. The evidence was overwhelming: forged signatures, stolen retirement funds, and the ultimate cruelty of abandoning elderly parents on a lonely road. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "This court finds the defendants guilty of elder fraud, financial exploitation, and abandonment of dependent adults." Mary felt tears spring to her eyes, but these weren't tears of sadness anymore. The defendants are sentenced to 18 months in county jail, full restitution of stolen funds, and mandatory support payments for the remainder of their parents' lives. The family property is hereby returned to George and Mary Patterson. As the judge's gavel fell, Mary wiped her cheek and turned to George. "God hasn't forgotten us," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The bailiff approached Robert with handcuffs, and for just a moment Robert looked across the courtroom at his father. He expected to see anger, hatred, the desire for revenge. Instead, he saw something that broke him more completely than any prison sentence ever could. He saw forgiveness. He saw love. He saw a father's heart that, despite everything, still ached for his son. That look would haunt Robert more than any prison cell. 6 months after the trial, George and Mary stood at the front gate of their old property, keys trembling in George's weathered hands. The small farmhouse looked tired and forgotten, covered in a thick layer of dust and neglect. Weeds had taken over Mary's flower beds, and the front porch sagged like an old man's shoulders. But it was home. "Well," George said, trying to keep his voice steady, "looks like we got our work cut out for us." David had driven them out from town, and word had already spread through the community. By afternoon, pickup trucks started arriving in the driveway. Neighbors came with cleaning supplies, tools, and casseroles wrapped in aluminum foil. "We heard you folks were coming home," said Mr. Jenkins from down the road, rolling up his sleeves. "Figure you could use some help getting this place back to rights." Mrs. Thompson arrived with her famous apple pie and a mop bucket. "Mary Patterson, don't you dare try to clean this whole house by yourself. We're going to make it shine like new." For the next few days, the old farmhouse buzzed with activity. George worked alongside the men, fixing the sagging porch and mending the broken fence posts. His back ached something fierce, but his heart felt lighter with each nail he hammered. Mary spent her time replanting her flower beds, her hands deep in the rich earth that had missed her touch. The roses she'd planted 20 years ago were still there, wild and overgrown, but alive. On the third evening, while unpacking their few belongings, Mary found something tucked in the bottom of an old cigar box, a photograph she'd forgotten about. It showed Robert and Linda as children, maybe 8 and 6 years old, laughing in the backyard sprinkler on a hot summer day. Their faces were bright with joy, their arms wrapped around each other. Mary held the picture against her chest and felt a single tear roll down her cheek. Despite everything they'd done, despite all the pain they'd caused, they were still her babies in that photograph. The question hung in the air like morning mist. Would you keep a picture like that, or throw it away with all the pain? A year had passed since George and Mary returned to their little piece of earth. The farmhouse had come back to life under their loving care and the help of generous neighbors. Mary's roses bloomed again, painting the yard in shades of pink and red. George's vegetable garden produced tomatoes so sweet that Mrs. Thompson declared them the best in the county. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm of morning coffee on the front porch, afternoon work in the garden, and evening prayers by the old oak tree George had planted when Robert was born. Then, one Tuesday morning, the mailman brought something unexpected, a letter with Linda's handwriting on the envelope. George and Mary sat together on their porch swing as George opened it with careful fingers. His voice was steady as he read aloud, "Dear Mom and Dad, I know I have no right to write to you after what Robert and I did. I've been working at a diner in another state, living in a small apartment, trying to rebuild my life from nothing. I'm not asking to come back. I'm not asking for forgiveness I don't deserve. I just wanted you to know that I think about you every day, and I'm sorry for the terrible pain we caused. I hope someday you might remember me as your daughter who lost her way, not the person who hurt you so deeply. With love and deep regret, Linda." George folded the letter slowly and closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was peace there, not anger. "Justice was done in court," he said quietly, reaching for Mary's hand. "But peace was given by God." Mary squeezed his fingers and nodded. "She's still our child, George, even after everything." As the sun began to set that evening, they sat together on their porch, hands intertwined like they'd been for 53 years. The fields stretched out before them, golden in the fading light. They weren't rich. Their bank account was modest, their house was small, their clothes were simple. But they had something that money couldn't buy and pain couldn't steal. They had dignity, they had faith, they had each other, and that was everything. George and Mary's story isn't just about two elderly people who found justice after being abandoned. It's about the power of dignity in the face of betrayal, the strength that comes from unwavering faith, and the truth that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the peace that comes from a clean conscience. Their children traded their souls for temporary luxury, but George and Mary held on to something that no one could steal: their integrity and their love for each other. This story challenges us to examine our own relationships and priorities. Are we building our lives on foundations of love and respect, or are we chasing after things that will crumble when tested? George and Mary lost everything material, but gained something far more valuable. They discovered that their worth wasn't determined by what their children did to them, but by who they chose to remain in the face of unimaginable pain. Their forgiveness didn't excuse their children's cruelty. It freed their own hearts from the poison of bitterness. What would you do if the people you sacrificed everything for turned their backs on you when you needed them most? Would you have the strength to forgive like George and Mary did? Or would bitterness consume your heart? When you look at your own life, are you building relationships based on what you can get from people or what you can give to them? If everything you owned was taken away tomorrow, what would be left of who you are? If this story touched your heart and made you think about the relationships in your own life, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss these powerful, life-changing stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of dignity and forgiveness. And don't forget to click on the video appearing on your screen right now to continue watching more inspiring stories that will challenge you to live with greater purpose and love. Your next life-changing story is just one click away.